32 years old and not a single proposal to show for it. Davina's voice cut through the ballroom sharper than the crystal ringing between champagne glasses around the supper table. Guests dressed in pearls and midnight velvet pretended not to hear, though every eye in the room shifted toward the same person. Verity Carden stood near the far end of the dining table, holding a glass of wine she had not touched once throughout the evening. Her dark gray gown blended against the stone pillars behind her, while the glow of the iron chandeliers above bathed every other woman in gold. Ottilie leaned closer to Davina with a rehearsed look of pity softening her face. Perhaps Father could arrange something with the church. I hear certain parishes accept women of a certain age for charitable work. Laughter rippled across the guests nearest them. Cressida, the youngest of the Carden sisters, rose with the confidence of someone who had never once been ignored in her life. She crossed the ballroom floor directly toward Verity and held out her left hand, turning her wrist so the square-cut emerald surrounded by diamonds caught every flicker of light in the room. She let the gesture linger, watching Verity's face with practiced amusement. I never tire of admiring it. Everett does have extraordinary taste. She paused, letting the silence sharpen around her words. But I suppose engagement rings remain rather unfamiliar to you, dear sister. Laughter spread further this time. Even guests who looked uncomfortable did nothing to stop it. Lord Edric Carden lifted his wineglass at the head of the table. Every daughter in this family has fulfilled her duty honorably. His eyes moved toward Verity. Then his gaze dropped away from her entirely, as though she were not worth finishing the sentence for. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything spoken before it. Verity's fingers tightened around the glass stem while heat climbed painfully across her chest. Near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a circle of admiring guests and ambitious mothers presenting their daughters with practiced smiles, Duke Calder Dunmore stood holding a glass of whiskey he had barely tasted. A silver-haired lord beside him gestured broadly toward the crowd. Surely, Your Grace, among all these fine women one must appeal. You cannot remain unmarried indefinitely. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then his voice carried across the ballroom, calm and deliberate, and cold enough to freeze every conversation within hearing distance. I would sooner marry a stranger than any woman performing in this room tonight. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Silence rippled outward from where he stood. Guests turned toward each other in shock. And directly behind him, close enough to feel the weight of every syllable, Verity Carden went completely still. Then the Duke turned. His dark eyes swept past the crowd, past the silk gowns and glittering jewels and rehearsed smiles, and landed directly on the woman in the gray dress, standing alone beside the pillar. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. But before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories filled with betrayal, heartbreak, jealousy, and powerful moments of vindication, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now let us continue. 6 months earlier. Morning light fell unevenly through the tall windows of Briarstone Hall, catching the dust drifting between the dark oak bookshelves lining the east corridor. The estate had once been considered among the finest in the northern counties. Marble staircases curved under painted ceilings. Fireplaces tall enough for a man to stand inside anchored every reception room. Portraits of Carden ancestors stretched across the walls in gilded frames older than most families in the district could trace their names. But elegance inside Briarstone Hall had become performance. Cracks ran under the polished surface in ways only Verity noticed. Roof tiles above the west wing leaked during heavy rain. Servants had not received full wages in 2 months. The wine cellar, once famous among visiting lords, now held mostly empty racks disguised behind the few remaining bottles pushed toward the front. Nobody discussed these things openly. The Carden name still carried enough weight to fill ballrooms and attract suitors for the younger daughters. Reputation was the only currency Lord Edric had left in reliable supply, and he spent it aggressively. Verity moved through the manor each morning before anyone else woke. She checked the kitchen stores, reviewed accounts the housekeeper could no longer manage alone, and renegotiated delivery costs with merchants who trusted her more than they trusted her father. By the time her sisters came downstairs for breakfast, every problem had already been solved invisibly. That particular morning, Verity carried a stack of pressed table linens toward the dining room when Lady Margot appeared at the top of the staircase, already dressed in lavender silk despite the early hour. "The Ashford party arrives this afternoon. Ensure the guest rooms are aired properly and fresh flowers are placed in the east wing." "Yes, mother." Lady Margot studied her eldest daughter briefly, the way someone might examine a painting hung in the wrong room. "And please wear something more suitable before guests arrive. That gray dress ages you terribly." Verity nodded without expression and continued walking. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was warmer. Steam rose from iron pots where porridge simmered beside fresh bread cooling on wooden racks. Briarstone's cook, a heavyset woman named Dormer, hummed beside the stove while two younger maids polished silver trays near the window. A small boy sat crying on a stool near the pantry door. Verity recognized him at once. Hamlin, the stable hand's youngest son, often wandered inside during cold mornings looking for warmth and leftover bread. She knelt beside him without hesitation. "What happened, sweetheart?" The boy held up his hand, showing a long red scratch across his palm from a loose nail in the stable gate. His lip trembled while tears rolled down his dirty cheeks. Verity pulled a clean cloth from her apron, dampened it with cool water from the basin, and wrapped his hand gently while speaking softly about the horses he loved watching through the fence. Within minutes, the boy stopped crying and accepted a warm bread roll she pressed into his good hand with a smile. Nobody else inside Briarstone Hall would have noticed the child was even there. Brinley, Verity's personal maid and the only person in the household who spoke to her without performance or obligation, appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying a pressed dress over her arm. "Your mother wants you in the blue damask before luncheon." Verity stood, brushing flour dust from her sleeve. She glanced at the bread roll the boy was now eating happily, then followed Brinley upstairs without complaint. From the drawing room above, the sound of Cressida's laughter drifted through the corridors like something bright and careless, belonging to a world Verity had stopped trying to enter years ago. Briarstone Hall operated on a single unspoken principle. The family's reputation mattered more than any individual member living inside it. Lord Edric Carden had inherited the estate from his father along with debts far larger than anyone outside the family knew. His response to financial decline was not economy but performance. He hosted dinners beyond his means, imported wines he could not afford, and dressed his younger daughters in fabrics paid for on credit extended by merchants too polite to refuse a lord's household publicly. The strategy worked because the three younger Carden sisters were extraordinary assets. Davina, the second eldest, had married Lord Aldous Pemberton 2 years earlier. The match brought modest land and a respectable family connection that Lord Edric referenced constantly during business conversations. Ottilie had recently become engaged to a rising politician named Clement Hargrave, whose family controlled textile mills across the Midlands, and Cressida, the youngest at 22, had just secured Everett Langdale, an industrialist's heir whose fortune made the entire Carden household exhale with visible relief. But the evening the engagement was announced. Every match had been celebrated with elaborate gatherings that Verity organized from behind the scenes and attended as a guest only in the loosest sense of the word. Then there was Verity. At 32, she occupied a position inside Briarstone Hall that had no comfortable name. She was not quite family in the way her sisters were treated. She was not staff, though she performed more labor than most of the servants. She existed in the silence between the two, useful enough to keep but never important enough to value publicly. During church visits on Sundays, women from neighboring estates whispered as Verity passed their pews. "She has a pleasant enough face, but time is merciless to women without husbands." Younger girls studied her with a mixture of curiosity and fear, as though her unmarried status were a disease they might catch if they lingered too close. Verity kept her eyes forward and her hands folded neatly in her lap through every service, absorbing the commentary the way stone absorbs rain, without sound and without end. What society did not know, and what Verity guarded more closely than anything else in her life, was that she had built something entirely her own beyond the walls of Briarstone Hall. For nearly 4 years, Verity had been producing detailed botanical illustrations. Delicate ink and watercolor studies of wildflowers, medicinal herbs, and rare plants she gathered during early morning walks across the estate grounds and surrounding woodlands. Through Brinley's cousin, a clerk at a publishing house in London, her work had been submitted under the pseudonym V. Ashridge. 2 volumes of illustrated botanical guides had already been printed and sold modestly well among educated readers and collectors. A 3rd manuscript sat hidden inside a false panel in her wardrobe, nearly completed. Nobody inside Briarstone Hall knew. Not her mother, not her sisters, and certainly not Lord Edric, who would have considered the entire enterprise beneath the dignity of a Carden daughter, regardless of how much dignity he had already sacrificed through his own financial mismanagement. The illustrations were not simply a hobby. They were the only proof Verity had that she existed as something more than a family disappointment. One evening after supper, while guests lingered in the drawing room discussing Cressida's upcoming engagement celebrations, Verity passed her father's study carrying a tray of emptied glasses back toward the kitchen. The door stood partially open, and Lord Edric's voice carried into the corridor. "Audley's match strengthens our position considerably, and once Cressida marries Langdale, the financial pressure eases substantially." A visiting gentleman responded with care. "And your eldest daughter?" Surely at her age, certain arrangements could still be considered. Silence filled the room for several seconds. Verity would require a dowry we cannot presently afford, and her prospects no longer justify the investment. Lord Edric's voice carried no cruelty. That was the worst part. He spoke about her the way a businessman speaks about a venture that no longer warrants further funding. Cold, factual, and already decided. Verity stood frozen in the dim corridor, the silver tray unsteady in her grip, while the glow from the study door cast a thin line of gold across her shoes. She did not cry. She had stopped crying over her father's indifference several years ago, but something behind her ribs tightened in a way that made breathing feel deliberate rather than natural. She continued walking before anyone noticed her standing there. Later that night, after the household had gone to sleep and the corridors fell into darkness except for the low glow of dying embers in the fireplaces, Verity sat at the small desk beside her bedroom window. Rain tapped steadily against the glass while she opened the hidden panel inside her wardrobe and removed the unfinished manuscript. For nearly 2 hours, she worked in silence by the light of a single candle, illustrating a detailed study of foxglove blossoms, each petal shaded with precise attention. It was the only thing in her life that felt entirely hers, the only space where nobody could dismiss her, overlook her, or calculate her value against a dowry that would never come. Downstairs, preparations for Cressida's engagement celebration had already begun. Fabric samples arrived from London that afternoon. Servants discussed floral arrangements in hushed voices while musicians were contacted about performing at the estate after a gap of over a year. Another sister was preparing to be celebrated. Another evening was approaching where Verity would organize everything, attend invisibly, and endure whatever public humiliation arrived alongside the champagne. She placed the manuscript back inside the hidden panel and closed the wardrobe door. Through the window, rain continued falling steadily across the dark grounds of Briarstone Hall, while the rest of the house slept peacefully, unaware that the woman holding everything together had never once been asked if she was all right. Briarstone Hall transformed over the following 3 weeks into something Verity barely recognized. Carriages arrived daily, carrying crates of imported champagne, bolts of ivory silk from London, vast glass vases painted with silver edges, and fresh roses shipped from a hothouse in the south that Lord Edric certainly could not afford, but ordered regardless. The ballroom, unused for nearly a year, was opened and scrubbed until the marble floors reflected the light of 100 candles like still water. Servants polished every silver surface in the estate, while towering floral arrangements were assembled on pedestals lining the entrance hall. The scent of melted wax, fresh lilies, roasted meats, and vanilla sponge cake drifted through every corridor from morning until well past midnight. Every conversation inside the manor revolved around Cressida. Lady Margot spent entire afternoons supervising gown fittings and debating seating arrangements with an intensity normally reserved for military campaigns. Lord Edric rehearsed introductions for Everett Langdale's family, adjusting his phrasing each time to emphasize the industrial fortune his youngest daughter was about to marry into. Even the servants moved differently, speaking in lower voices and walking faster through the hallways, terrified of making mistakes before wealthy guests who might judge the household. Verity managed everything behind it all. She supervised the kitchen when Dormer fell ill for 2 days with a fever. She resolved a dispute between the florist and the head butler over vase placements that nearly delayed the entire West Wing decoration. She personally inspected 14 guest rooms, replacing linens, adjusting curtains, and ensuring fireplaces were properly laid before visitors arrived from 3 counties. She reorganized the seating arrangement 4 separate times after Lady Margot changed her mind repeatedly without apology. By the morning of the celebration, exhaustion had settled so deeply under Verity's eyes that Brinley paused while helping her dress and touched her arm gently. "You need rest." Verity shook her head. "Not today." Nobody thanked her once. Cressida swept through the manor that afternoon as though the celebration had already crowned her. Her gown, made from pale champagne satin with seed pearls stitched across the bodice, caught the light from every window she passed. Diamond earrings borrowed from Lady Margot's private collection rested against her neck, while 2 maids followed behind, adjusting her gloves and train every few minutes. As Verity carried fresh candles toward the ballroom entrance, Cressida paused in the corridor and studied her with mild irritation. The napkins in the dining room are folded unevenly. "Honestly, Verity, if you cannot manage basic table settings after all these years, perhaps we should simply hire additional staff and spare you the embarrassment." Verity set the candles down and walked to the dining room to refold every napkin herself. By evening, Briarstone Hall overflowed with guests. Noblewomen in embroidered silk glided through the ballroom holding glasses, while gentlemen gathered beside the fireplaces, discussing horse racing and parliamentary gossip. Long dining tables displayed platters of roasted venison glazed with red currant, buttered parsnips, smoked trout arranged on beds of watercress, warm bread rolls with salted butter, and layered fruit tarts dusted with powdered sugar. The golden light from chandeliers above made everything shimmer. Verity stood near the musicians, straightening glasses on a side table, when an elderly countess approached her with a warm but careless smile. "You there, dear. Would you fetch me another glass of the white wine? The Riesling, if there is any remaining." The countess did not realize she was speaking to the eldest daughter of the house. Verity smiled politely and poured the wine without correcting her. From across the room, Cressida watched the exchange and whispered something to Ottilie that made them both laugh behind their fans. The humiliation deepened at supper. Cressida sat proudly beside Everett Langdale, while guests raised their glasses in toast after toast to the couple's future. Everett smiled handsomely throughout the evening, though Verity noticed him checking his pocket watch twice when he thought nobody was looking, and once she overheard him asking a gentleman beside him about a factory dispute that seemed to worry him more than anything his fiancé was saying. But Cressida noticed nothing beyond her own reflection in every admiring glance directed toward her. When dessert arrived, Lady Margot instructed Verity to assist the overwhelmed servants in distributing lemon syllabub among the guests personally. As Verity placed a dish before the head table, Cressida laughed lightly beside Everett. "Do be careful, sister. If you continue serving guests this attentively, they may offer you a position in their own households." Scattered laughter crossed the table. Verity lowered her eyes and continued walking. Then Davina added from further down the table, her voice carrying easily above the music. She would finally have a purpose, at least. Better late than never. The laughter spread wider this time. Even guests who looked uncomfortable said nothing to stop it. Lady Margot caught Verity's eye from across the room and gave a tight smile that communicated a single instruction. "Do not react. Do not embarrass the family by showing emotion." Verity nodded once and kept moving between the tables until every dish had been placed. Her hands did not shake until she was certain nobody could see them. Hours later, after the last carriage departed and the musicians packed their instruments into leather cases beside the entrance hall, Verity locked herself inside her bedroom. The silence there pressed against her chest after an evening spent swallowing words she would never be allowed to say. She sat at her vanity, still wearing the same gray dress, her reflection staring back at her with an expression she barely recognized. A knock interrupted the stillness. Brinley entered, carrying a cup of warm chamomile sweetened with honey. She placed it beside the vanity without waiting to be invited, and stood for a moment. "I thought you might not sleep tonight." Verity wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I am being foolish." Brinley shook her head. "No, miss. You are being treated cruelly by people who should love you, and there is nothing foolish about feeling the weight of that." The kindness in those words nearly broke Verity completely. She pressed her lips together tightly and stared at the teacup while tears gathered along her lashes. Brinley placed a hand briefly on Verity's shoulder, then left the room without another word, closing the door softly behind her. Alone again, Verity sat motionless for a long time. Then she opened the hidden wardrobe panel, removed her unfinished manuscript, and began illustrating by the warm glow of her desk candle. A detailed study of hawthorn blossoms, each brushstroke slow, each line precise, each petal shaded with the kind of care nobody inside Briarstone Hall had ever shown her. It was the only way she knew to survive the nights that followed evenings like this one. Outside, a cold wind moved through the grounds of the estate while autumn leaves scattered across the gravel drive. Somewhere inside the house, Cressida's laughter still echoed faintly through the corridors. And somewhere far to the north, a man Verity Carden had never met sat alone in a vast study overlooking black cliffs and crashing waves, reading correspondence he had no desire to answer, surrounded by silence nearly as heavy as her own. Long before the silence settled permanently inside Verity Carden, there had been music. At 22, she moved through Briarstone Hall with a warmth that surprised guests who expected aristocratic reserve. She played piano in the evenings beside open windows while the scent of jasmine drifted through the corridors from the garden below. She laughed openly during suppers, debated poetry with visiting scholars, and once stunned an elderly professor by correcting his Latin translation of a passage from Ovid, while her sisters sat bewildered beside their untouched desserts. Lord Edric had not yet given up on her then. She was still young enough to be considered promising, still beautiful enough to attract attention during social gatherings, and still naive enough to believe that the family she served so faithfully would eventually value her in return. That was before Leander Hale entered her life. Leander arrived at Briarstone Hall during the autumn of 1841, accompanying a naturalist invited by Lord Edric to assess the commercial value of timber across the estate's northern woodlands. Unlike the nobleman Verity usually encountered at family gatherings, Leander carried no arrogance and wore no pretense. He was the son of a country physician, educated beyond his social rank through scholarships and relentless curiosity. He spoke with intention, listened with genuine attention, and treated every person inside the household with the same respect, regardless of their position. Their first real conversation happened beside the glass doors of the conservatory, where Verity had been sketching a climbing rose she had trained along the ironwork trellis outside. Leander paused while crossing the corridor, noticed the drawing, and asked a question about the root structure that revealed he understood botany far better than most men she had ever spoken to. They talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon. The following week, he brought her a book on alpine wildflowers he had found in a London bookshop, inscribed with a small note on the inside cover, "For the woman who sees what others walk past." By the third week, Verity found herself listening for his footsteps in the corridors each afternoon, without admitting to herself why her chest tightened whenever she heard them approaching. Leander understood parts of her that nobody else in her life had ever noticed. While society measured her only against marriage prospects and fading youth, he admired her intelligence, her artistic eye, and the stubbornness hidden under her composed manners. They spent long afternoons walking through the estate grounds discussing literature, philosophy, and natural history, while fallen leaves drifted across the ornamental lake. Sometimes he read aloud from field journals while Verity sketched the specimens he described. Once, during a late afternoon when golden light fell through the conservatory glass and neither of them had noticed 2 hours passing, Leander looked at her drawing of a foxglove stem and said something she never forgot. "You see the world the way most people only pretend to." Verity felt chosen for who she truly was, not for her family name, not for her appearance, and not for whatever dowry her father might offer. Chosen for the parts of herself she had always been told did not matter. Even Brinley noticed the change. "You are different lately," the maid said one morning while arranging Verity's hair before breakfast. "Lighter somehow." Verity blushed at once and said nothing, but the happiness was unmistakable. She had begun to believe that her life might hold something beyond the suffocating expectations of Briarstone Hall. But happiness inside the Carden household was never permitted to exist without cost. One rainy evening, Lord Edric entered the conservatory unexpectedly and found Leander and Verity seated close together beside the glass doors. Leander had been reading aloud from a volume of Keats, while Verity listened with open admiration written across her face. A half-finished illustration of wild orchids lay between them on the table. The atmosphere changed at once. Lord Edric's expression darkened with a fury that silenced the room before he spoke a single word. Later that night, his voice thundered through the study loudly enough for servants to hear through the walls. "You dared pursue my daughter knowing you carry neither title nor fortune nor any prospect worthy of this family's name." Leander stood straight despite the humiliation. "I love her sincerely, my lord, and she deserves someone who values her mind as much as her name. Love does not preserve estates." Lord Edric's voice dropped into something colder than shouting. "Love does not settle debts or protect reputations. You are nothing, and you will leave this house by morning." Verity begged. She stood in the corridor outside the study door and pleaded with her father through the wood until her voice broke. Lady Margot appeared behind her and took her arm firmly. "You are making a spectacle of yourself. This is precisely why women cannot be trusted with their own judgment in these matters." Leander was ordered to leave at once. The next morning, Verity found him waiting beside the garden gate in heavy rain. His traveling case rested against the carriage wheel, while water soaked through his dark coat and flattened his hair against his forehead. His face carried the expression of a man trying to memorize something he knew he was about to lose. "I will come back for you," he said while holding her hands tightly between his own. "No matter how long it takes, I will find a way to return." Verity could not answer. She stood at the gate long after the carriage disappeared beyond the hills, rain streaming across her face until Brinley finally came outside with a shawl and guided her back into the house without speaking. For months she waited. Every post-delivery made her heart climb painfully into her throat. She checked the morning tray before anyone else woke, searching for handwriting she would have recognized from across a room. Nothing came. Autumn turned to winter. The silence from Leander grew heavier with each passing week until it became a weight she carried physically. Then the letter arrived. Not from Leander. From a solicitor in Bristol. Leander Hale had contracted typhoid fever during a botanical expedition along the southern coast of Portugal. He had died in a small clinic outside Lisbon, far from home, far from anyone who loved him. Among his possessions returned to his family was a half-written letter addressed to Verity Carden. Brinley handed her the solicitor's notice on a gray Tuesday morning in February. Verity read it standing beside the kitchen window, while steam rose from a teacup she had just poured. The cup slipped from her fingers and shattered across the stone floor. She did not move. She did not speak. She stood perfectly still while the world around her became something distant and strange, like a room observed through frosted glass. She locked herself inside her bedroom for 6 days afterward. She refused food, refused conversation, refused sunlight. Brinley left trays outside the door 3 times daily and listened through the wood for any sound that might tell her the woman inside was still breathing. When Verity finally emerged, something essential had changed behind her eyes. The young woman who once laughed beside piano music and corrected scholars over supper had disappeared without farewell. In her place stood someone composed, efficient, and so thoroughly silent that guests sometimes forgot she was in the room entirely. The botanical illustrations began shortly after. Verity never told anyone why she started them, but Brinley understood without asking. The drawings were not simply art. They were a continuation of every conversation Leander never lived long enough to finish, and the hidden panel inside the wardrobe became the only place in Briarstone Hall where Verity Carden still existed completely. The years that followed Leander's death moved through Briarstone Hall like seasons observed through a window. Verity watched them pass without participating. Davina married Lord Aldous Pemberton during a spring ceremony attended by half the county. Verity arranged the flowers, supervised the breakfast service, pressed the table linens, and stood near the back of the church in a dress she had worn to 3 previous gatherings because nobody thought to order her a new one. During the wedding breakfast, Davina raised her glass and thanked her parents, her new husband, her sisters Ottilie and Cressida by name, and the household staff collectively. Verity's name was not mentioned once. She smiled through the entire reception and did not allow herself to feel the absence until she was alone that night, sitting at her desk with a candle burning low, illustrating a sprig of forget-me-nots with hands that shook only slightly. Ottilie's engagement to Clement Hargrave followed 18 months later, and with it came another wave of preparations that consumed Verity entirely. Ottilie's demands were more restrained than Cressida's, but no less exhausting. She required every detail to reflect intellectual sophistication rather than mere wealth. Verity sourced rare editions of philosophy texts to display in the guest library. She arranged for a string quartet that specialized in chamber music rather than dance waltzes. She personally wrote place cards in calligraphy because Ottilie insisted printed ones appeared common. During the engagement dinner, Clement Hargrave barely looked at his fiancée throughout the evening. His attention remained fixed on political discussions with Lord Edric and 2 visiting members of Parliament. Ottilie smiled gracefully through every course. But Verity noticed her sister's fingers tightening around her wine glass each time Clement turned away from her mid-sentence to respond to another man's question instead. Later that evening, while carrying empty dessert plates toward the kitchen, Verity passed the drawing room and overheard Ottilie speaking through the partially open door. "You did not once acknowledge me during supper." Ottilie's voice was controlled but strained. Clement answered without looking up from the documents spread across his lap. "I acknowledged you when I proposed. I should not need to repeat myself nightly. Politics requires my attention. Your insecurities do not." The coldness in his voice could have frozen the glass in the windows. Verity continued walking before she heard more, but that brief exchange planted something uncomfortable in her chest. Not satisfaction. Something closer to grief. Even the sisters who mocked her endlessly were marrying men who did not truly see them either. The difference was that Verity already knew what it felt like to be invisible. Her sisters were only just beginning to learn. Cressida's wedding to Everett Langdale took place the following autumn under skies so gray they seemed to press physically against the church roof. The ceremony itself was grand enough to distract from the weather. Imported flowers lined every pew. A choir sang hymns that echoed through the stone nave while guests wrapped in fur-trimmed coats admired the spectacle Lord Edric had orchestrated almost entirely on credit. Verity stood near the back again, holding her gloves tightly against the cold, watching another sister step into a carriage decorated with white ribbon and drive toward a life she had been promised would bring happiness, though the evidence accumulating around them suggested otherwise. At the wedding breakfast afterward, Cressida raised her champagne glass and smiled radiantly beside Everett. 3 daughters married, 3 honors delivered. She paused for effect while guests laughed politely. "I believe that concludes the family's obligations." The comment landed precisely where it was aimed. Several guests glanced toward Verity before looking away. Davina smirked behind her glass. Ottilie tilted her head with rehearsed sympathy. "Do not take it personally, sister. Some women are simply meant for other paths." Verity said nothing. She placed her untouched glass on the nearest table and walked outside into the cold. Within months of her wedding, reports began reaching Briarstone Hall that troubled Verity more than the mockery ever had. Davina visited the estate more frequently than a happily married woman should. Her expensive gowns gradually became simpler. Her jewelry, once displayed aggressively, began disappearing piece by piece. During one particularly tense afternoon tea, Verity overheard Davina arguing with Lady Margot in the morning room. "Aldous lost nearly everything at the tables last month. I cannot keep pretending this is temporary." Lady Margot's response was sharp. "You will keep pretending because the alternative is public humiliation for this entire family. Smile. Manage your household. and do not speak of this again outside these walls." Davina left the room without another word, but her eyes were red when she passed Verity in the corridor. For one brief moment, the two sisters looked at each other. Then Davina straightened her shoulders and walked past as though nothing had happened. Ottilie's situation surfaced more gradually. Clement Hargrave had been elected to Parliament and now spent most weeks in London, leaving Ottilie alone in their estate with staff who answered to him rather than to her. Letters from Ottilie arrived at Briarstone Hall with increasing frequency, always written in cheerful language that grew less convincing with every page. Verity read between the lines effortlessly. Loneliness had settled into her sister's marriage like damp into old stone. And Cressida, whose diamond ring had once been displayed like a conquered trophy, returned from a visit to Everett's family estate, looking thinner and more subdued than anyone had seen her before. She said nothing specific, but Verity noticed dark circles under her eyes and a quietness in her manner that had never existed before. None of this softened the sisters' treatment of Verity. If anything, their cruelty sharpened as their own lives darkened. Misery did not make them kinder. It made them hungrier for someone to stand below them. One evening, after a family dinner where all three sisters had returned to Briarstone Hall for a rare gathering, Verity excused herself early and walked toward the servants' corridor behind the kitchen. She needed silence away from the laughter that always seemed to grow louder whenever she was present, as though her existence provided the contrast necessary for everyone else to feel successful. Near the pantry entrance, she paused. Two kitchen maids were speaking in low voices while drying dishes beside the basin. "Miss Verity does more for this household than all of them combined," one whispered, "and not a single word of thanks. Ever. She is the only one who remembers our names," the other replied. "The others look through us like we are furniture." Verity stood motionless in the shadowed corridor, listening while something painful expanded behind her ribs. Even the servants could see what her own family refused to acknowledge. She continued walking before they noticed her standing there. Later that same night, while returning upstairs with a candle, Verity paused outside Lord Edric's study after hearing her own name spoken behind the closed door. Lady Margot's voice carried through the wood, calm and deliberate. Once Cressida's first social season as a married woman concludes, it may be best for Verity to relocate to Aunt Heloise's property in Shropshire, permanently. Lord Edric sighed. People have begun asking questions at gatherings. Her presence creates awkwardness. She embarrasses the family simply by remaining here unmarried at her age. A long silence followed before Lady Margot spoke again. "I will write to Heloise next week. There is no reason to delay further." Verity stood perfectly still in the dark corridor. The candle flame wavered in her hand, casting unsteady shadows across the wall beside her. She did not gasp. She did not cry. She absorbed the words the way she had absorbed everything else across the past decade, completely and without sound. They were not simply ignoring her anymore. They were erasing her. She returned to her bedroom, placed the candle beside her desk, and sat for a very long time staring at the wardrobe that held the only evidence of a life she had built entirely without their knowledge or permission. Through the window, the autumn sky stretched dark and starless above Briarstone Hall. And somewhere inside the house below, her family continued planning a future that no longer included her in it. The days following the overheard conversation outside her father's study moved through Verity like a slow poison. She continued performing her duties inside Briarstone Hall with the same precision. She supervised the kitchen. She reviewed household accounts. She pressed linens and arranged flowers and ensured every room was properly maintained before guests arrived for the small gatherings Lady Margot still hosted regularly. Nothing outwardly changed. But something fundamental had shifted under the surface. The family had not simply dismissed her. They had decided, calmly and deliberately, to remove her from their lives entirely. Not through cruelty or confrontation, but through bureaucratic efficiency. A letter to Aunt Heloise. A relocation presented as kindness. A disappearance so gradual that society would barely notice she had gone. Verity lay awake most nights now, staring at the ceiling while rain tapped against the windows and the house settled into its familiar creaks around her. Sleep came rarely and never deeply. Her appetite faded until Brinley began leaving plates of bread and cheese outside her door, with notes that said nothing more than "Please eat." One evening, after the household had retired and the corridors fell dark except for the low amber glow of a single candle on her desk, Verity opened the wardrobe panel and removed all 3 manuscripts. The 2 published volumes, the nearly completed third. She spread them across her bed and looked at them for a long time. Hundreds of illustrations, years of work completed in silence and secrecy. Every petal, every root system, every shading of color represented hours stolen from a life that offered her nothing else. She had built something real and valuable entirely on her own, and nobody inside this house would ever know or care. Her hand moved toward the candle flame. For several terrible seconds, she held the edge of the oldest manuscript close enough to feel the heat curl against the paper. One movement and years of work would disappear into smoke and ash, and perhaps that was appropriate, because everything else she had ever built or loved had disappeared just as completely. Then she stopped. Not because hope returned, not because she suddenly believed things would improve. She stopped because the illustrations were the only honest thing left in her life, and destroying them would mean the family had finally taken everything, even the parts they never knew existed. She placed the manuscripts back inside the hidden panel with care, closed the wardrobe door, and pressed her forehead against the wood for a long time without moving. Brinley found her the next morning asleep at her desk, still dressed, with the candle burned down to a stub of cold wax beside her hand. The maid draped a blanket across her shoulders without waking her and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching with an expression that held equal measures of tenderness and fury toward the household that had brought this woman to such a place. 3 days later, an invitation arrived at Briarstone Hall that changed the temperature of every room inside it. A formal request, sealed with dark crimson wax, and stamped with a crest nobody in the Carden family had ever received correspondence from before. Lord Edric opened it at breakfast and read it twice before setting it down on the table. Lady Margot looked up from her tea. "Well?" His voice carried an unfamiliar mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Duke Calder Dunmore requests our attendance at a society gathering hosted at Ashworth House in London." His eyes moved across the table toward his 3 married daughters, who had returned to Briarstone for the week. All of us. Every head at the table turned. Even Verity looked up from her untouched plate. Nobody noticed the way her hands tightened under the tablecloth, but Brinley, standing near the doorway, did. Across the northern counties, the name Calder Dunmore carried a weight that made powerful men choose their words with precision. His estates stretched from the Yorkshire coastline deep into the moorlands, encompassing tenant farms, coal interests, shipping warehouses, and forestry operations that generated income most noble families could not comprehend. Politicians sought his endorsement with the caution of men approaching an unpredictable animal. Bankers extended credit to his name without hesitation. Even families whose titles predated the Norman conquest treated the Duke of Dunmore with a respect that bordered on wariness. At 38 years old, Calder Dunmore had become one of the wealthiest and most influential men in England, yet people feared him almost as much as they admired him. Dunmore Keep, his principal estate, stood on a headland overlooking the North Sea where black cliffs dropped sharply into churning gray water below. The house itself was vast and ancient, built from dark stone that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Corridors stretched endlessly between rooms too large for one person to occupy comfortably. Fireplaces tall enough to stand inside anchored every hall, though most remained unlit because the Duke rarely used more than 4 rooms in the entire building. Servants moved through the house with deliberate care, keeping their voices low and their movements efficient whenever the Duke was present, not because he was cruel to them. He treated his staff fairly and paid wages above what most estates offered. But there was a stillness around him that made people instinctively lower their voices, the way a room falls silent when someone carrying grief enters it. Calder rarely smiled anymore. He had not attended a ball in over 2 years. Most evenings he sat alone inside his private study, surrounded by estate ledgers, shipping contracts, and glasses of whiskey he poured but seldom finished, while wind battered against the windows overlooking the sea. Invitations to London gatherings piled unopened on his desk in stacks, his butler removed every few weeks. He had not always been this way. 7 years earlier, London society had watched with fascination as Calder Dunmore began courting Lady Seraphine Culworth. Seraphine possessed the kind of beauty that reorganized rooms around her. Men stopped speaking when she entered. Women studied her gowns and copied her hairstyles within days of every public appearance. She moved through ballrooms with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much power her appearance granted her and had no intention of wasting it. Beside Calder, she appeared destined to become one of the most celebrated duchesses in English history. He believed it. More dangerously, he believed her. He gifted her jewelry that arrived in velvet cases from London's finest craftsmen. He funded extensive repairs to her family's crumbling estate in Hampshire. He spoke openly about marriage at gatherings where society columnists recorded every word. For the first time in his adult life, the immense silence inside Dunmore Keep had felt like something that might eventually be filled. Then the letters surfaced. Calder discovered them by accident, hidden inside a writing desk Seraphine had left unlocked during a visit to the keep. Dozens of letters, written over the course of nearly a year, exchanged with Lord Marius Fenthorpe. The affair had been sustained and deliberate. Seraphine had maintained her public devotion to the Duke with flawless precision, while conducting an entirely separate relationship behind every closed door available to her. The betrayal itself cut deeply. The public humiliation that followed nearly destroyed him. Rumors moved through London with the speed of fire through dry timber. Noble women whispered behind opera glasses while gentlemen exchanged knowing looks across card tables at private clubs. The powerful Duke of Dunmore, deceived by a beautiful woman who had calculated his usefulness down to the last pound. What wounded Calder most was not the affair itself. It was what Seraphine told him during their final confrontation inside the drawing room at Dunmore Keep. Her composure never faltered. She stood beside the fireplace in a gown the color of midnight, diamonds at her throat, and spoke with the calmness of someone settling an account. "You were stability, Calder. Marius was something I actually wanted." She left the keep that evening in a carriage he had paid for, wearing jewels he had gifted her, and did not look back through the window once. Calder stood in the entrance hall for a long time after the carriage disappeared, listening to the silence resettle around him like water filling a space where something had been removed. After that night, he withdrew from society so completely that people began inventing explanations. Some claimed madness. Others suggested illness. The truth was simpler and less dramatic. Calder no longer believed that any affection offered to him existed without calculation behind it. Women continued pursuing him relentlessly. At the few gatherings he attended out of political necessity, ambitious mothers maneuvered daughters into his path with transparent urgency. Young noble women laughed too loudly beside him, complimented his estates with rehearsed admiration, and angled for invitations to the keep with questions designed to sound spontaneous but were plainly prepared weeks in advance. He responded to all of them with the same polite distance that society interpreted as coldness, but was actually something closer to exhaustion. Many women called him heartless, others called him proud. None of them understood that he was simply a man who had stopped believing that the version of himself people claimed to admire had anything to do with who he actually was. One January evening, while sleet hammered against the study windows and the fire crackled low inside the grate, Calder's mother entered the room carrying a tray of roasted chicken, warm bread, and black tea. The Dowager Duchess Fenella Dunmore was the only person alive who entered his study without knocking, and the only person whose company he never found draining. She set the tray beside the fireplace and studied her son with the steady gaze of a woman who had watched him disappear inside himself for the better part of a decade. "You skipped supper again. I was not hungry." "You are never hungry, yet somehow you remain alive, which suggests you eat when nobody is watching, which is exactly the kind of behavior that concerns me." Calder almost smiled but stopped himself. Fenella sat in the chair opposite him without invitation. "She destroyed something in you. I understand that. But you have allowed the destruction to become permanent, and that is no longer her fault. It is yours." Calder stared at the fire for a long time. "Most people who approach me want something. The ones who disguise it best are the most dangerous. Fenella's voice softened. And you believe every woman alive operates that way? I believe the evidence supports it. The Dowager Duchess sighed. The greatest tragedy of her life was not her husband's early death or the financial pressures of managing a sprawling estate during difficult years. It was watching her only son build walls so high around himself that even she could barely see over them anymore. Weeks later, a formal invitation arrived from Lord Edric Carden, requesting the Duke's attendance at a society gathering in London connected to the Carden family's social circle. Calder would normally have ignored it without a second thought, but Lord Edric had recently become associated with several industrial investors whose shipping interests overlapped with Dunmore operations along the eastern coast. Refusing entirely risked creating unnecessary friction during sensitive negotiations. Calder read the invitation twice, then placed it beside the untouched stack of correspondence on his desk. His butler, a measured man named Hargrove who had served the family for over 30 years, stood near the doorway. "Shall I send regrets?" "Your Grace." Calder was silent for several seconds. Then he spoke without looking up. "Prepare the carriage for London. One evening, I will attend and leave before midnight." Hargrove nodded once and withdrew without further comment, though he paused briefly in the corridor outside, surprised enough by the answer to stand still for a moment before continuing. The night of the gathering arrived wrapped in cold rain and fog that turned London's streets into rivers of reflected gaslight. Servants fastened Calder's dark coat while horses stamped impatiently outside the townhouse entrance. Inside the carriage, silence surrounded him completely, except for the rhythmic sound of wheels over wet cobblestones. As the journey continued through the city, distant lights from Ashworth House appeared through the rain ahead. Calder leaned back against the leather seat and watched them approach without expression. He expected another ballroom filled with people who performed warmth while calculating advantage. Another evening endured for the sake of business obligations that could not be ignored without consequence. He did not expect what actually happened when he walked through those doors. The moment Duke Calder Dunmore entered the ballroom at Ashworth House, the atmosphere shifted as visibly as weather changing across an open field. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The string quartet softened uncertainly, as though the musicians themselves had lost confidence. Noble women straightened their posture and adjusted gloves, while mothers leaned toward daughters with whispered instructions delivered behind painted fans. "Do not stare. Smile naturally. Wait for him to approach." The ballroom glittered with the kind of wealth designed to impress rather than comfort. Chandeliers hung from ceiling moldings gilded with gold leaf. Polished marble floors reflected hundreds of candle flames that danced inside glass holders arranged along every surface. Servants moved between guests, carrying silver trays of champagne, sugared fruit, roasted quail on beds of herbed butter, smoked salmon arranged with capers and thin bread, and tiny lemon tarts glazed with pale icing that shimmered in the warm light. Lord Edric hurried forward to greet the Duke personally, his hand extended and his voice carrying the particular warmth reserved exclusively for men wealthier than himself. Lady Margot followed closely, her posture transformed by excitement she could barely contain. Across the room, Cressida adjusted her emerald earrings and whispered something to Davina. Audley straightened beside Clement, who was too absorbed in political conversation to notice anything happening around him. And Verity stood near the far wall, beside a stone pillar, holding a glass of wine she had not tasted once throughout the evening. Her dark gray gown blended against the ballroom's deeper shadows. She had not wanted to attend. Lady Margot had insisted, though the reasoning was unclear, since nobody inside the family intended to introduce her to anyone or include her in any conversation of consequence. She watched the Duke's arrival the way she watched everything inside these gatherings, from the edges, without expectation. Lady Seraphine Colworth arrived within the hour. She wore deep crimson silk that moved like liquid when she walked, with diamonds resting against her collarbone in a pattern that caught the light from every angle in the room. Her dark hair was arranged under jeweled pins, and her bearing upon entering suggested a woman who fully expected the evening to end in her favor. She moved through the crowd directly toward Calder, greeting him with a familiarity that carried equal measures of warmth and ownership. Calder responded with nothing more than a courteous nod. His expression did not change. His body did not turn toward her. The dismissal was so subtle that only people watching closely would have noticed it. But Seraphine noticed it at once. Her smile remained intact, but something behind her eyes tightened. For the next hour, the ballroom orbited around the Duke like a system of planets competing for proximity to the sun. Young women appeared beside him in timed rotations. They complimented his estates, praised his political influence, asked about Dunmore Keep with feigned curiosity, and laughed at remarks that were not particularly amusing. Calder answered each of them politely, briefly, and without warmth. His attention wandered constantly across the room rather than settling on any face presented to him. The silver-haired lord who had been hovering nearby for most of the evening finally pressed the question directly. "Surely, Your Grace, among all these fine women, one must appeal. You cannot remain unmarried indefinitely." Calder's jaw tightened. Something cold and exhausted moved behind his eyes. "I would sooner marry a stranger than any woman performing in this room tonight." The words carried across the nearest tables. Conversations faltered. Guests exchanged glances of shock and barely concealed fascination. Several young women flushed with embarrassment. And directly behind him, standing so close that the words landed against her like a physical weight, Verity Carden went completely still. She had been adjusting a flower arrangement that had shifted on its pedestal near the Duke's circle. Nobody had noticed her there. Nobody ever noticed her anywhere. But the sentence passed through her body and settled somewhere under her ribs, not because it was cruel, but because it described exactly what she already was: a stranger, invisible, present in a room full of people who looked directly past her as though she occupied no space at all. Then the Duke turned. His movement was unhurried, almost involuntary, as though something behind him had pulled at his attention without his permission. His dark eyes swept past the silk gowns, past the diamond necklaces, past the rehearsed smiles and eager postures, and landed on the woman in the gray dress standing motionless beside the displaced flower arrangement. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. Then, a sharp crash broke the stillness. A young servant girl carrying a tray of champagne had stumbled against the edge of a table. Glasses shattered across the marble floor, while pale liquid spread in every direction. The girl froze in visible terror as nearby guests stepped backward in irritation. "Clumsy creature," one woman muttered. Another sighed loudly. The servant's hands shook violently as she dropped to her knees, trying to gather broken glass with bare fingers. A thin line of blood appeared across her palm. Before anyone else in the room moved, Verity was already kneeling beside her. "It is all right," she whispered while taking the girl's bleeding hand into her own. "Stop. You will cut yourself further." She removed a clean handkerchief from her sleeve and wrapped the wound with steady calm, speaking softly enough that only the girl could hear her. "You are not in trouble. Breathe. It is only glass." The servant girl's panic eased gradually. Her breathing steadied, the shaking slowed. Verity helped her stand, guided her toward the service corridor away from the staring guests, and returned to the ballroom moments later with wine staining the hem of her gown and not a trace of self-consciousness on her face. Calder had watched the entire scene without moving. A lock turned inside his chest. Not a door thrown open. Something subtler and older than that. Every woman in this room had spent the evening performing for his attention. Seraphine had positioned herself strategically. The young noblewomen had rehearsed their laughter and polished their compliments. And this woman, whose name he did not even know, had knelt on a marble floor in an expensive ballroom and wrapped a servant's bleeding hand with her own handkerchief, without once considering who might be watching. He set his glass down and began walking. The movement drew attention at once. Guests tracked his path across the ballroom with visible confusion. Seraphine, who had been watching from beside the fireplace, straightened expectantly. Cressida whispered something sharp to Davina. Calder walked past all of them. He stopped directly before Verity, who looked up at him with an expression of genuine surprise that contained none of the calculation he had grown accustomed to seeing in the faces of women who knew his name and title. "Miss Carden," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear him. "Would you honor me with a dance?" The ballroom fell silent. Verity's face flushed while dozens of stunned guests stared openly. Her sister's expressions froze in varying states of disbelief. Her voice barely held. "I am not certain I would be a suitable partner, Your Grace. I have not danced in some time." A faint movement crossed his expression, something almost resembling warmth. "Neither have I." Her unsteady fingers rested in his hand. The string quartet, startled into action by a subtle nod from the host, began a waltz. Calder guided her across the polished floor while the room watched in absolute stillness. Verity moved stiffly at first, overwhelmed by the weight of attention surrounding them. He noticed at once. "You seem uncomfortable. I am unaccustomed to being visible." The honesty in her answer struck something inside him that rehearsed flattery had never reached. They danced in silence for several measures before she spoke again, almost to herself. "You said you would sooner marry a stranger." She paused. "You should know that everyone in this room considers me exactly that." He looked at her for a long time before responding. "Then perhaps I chose the right partner after all." Around them, whispers spread between guests like fire moving through dry grass. Why her? She is the eldest Carden daughter, the one nobody speaks about. Did you see Seraphine's face? By the time the waltz ended and Verity stepped back with her cheeks still burning and her fingers still unsteady at her sides, society had already begun talking. And Duke Calder Dunmore, for the first time in 7 years, did not leave before midnight. In the weeks that followed the gathering at Ashworth House, Duke Calder Dunmore began visiting Briarstone Hall with a frequency that first puzzled society and then consumed it entirely. His carriage appeared on the gravel drive so regularly that servants began preparing his preferred tea, strong black Darjeeling without sugar, before the sound of hooves even reached the front gates. At first, London drawing rooms treated the visits as harmless curiosity, a wealthy duke amusing himself with an unlikely acquaintance. Then newspapers began printing observations about the mysterious attention the Duke of Dunmore seemed to be directing toward Lord Edric Carden's unmarried eldest daughter. Gossip moved through ballrooms, churches, and afternoon tea gatherings with the speed of a contagion. Perhaps he pities her. No man of his position visits a woman repeatedly without calculating the return. Surely there must be another explanation. Inside Briarstone Hall, the transformation was shameless. Lord Edric suddenly invited Verity to sit beside important guests during supper. He asked her opinion during conversations whenever Calder visited, and introduced her before visiting businessmen with a pride that had never existed before the Duke's carriage first appeared on their drive. Lady Margot's behavior shifted even more dramatically. Expensive gowns began arriving from London, deep blue silk, pale silver satin trimmed with lace, and embroidered shawls that cost more than the household spent on kitchen provisions in a month. Verity's wardrobe, previously ignored, became Lady Margot's primary concern before every gathering. "You must wear your hair differently," her mother insisted one afternoon, while adjusting a borrowed pearl necklace around Verity's throat. The Duke notices refinement. Verity barely recognized the attention. After 32 years of being treated as an inconvenience, the sudden warmth felt less like affection and more like a costume her family had decided to dress her in, because an important audience was watching. Her sisters recognized it at once, and they despised it. Davina's bitterness had deepened steadily since Lord Aldous Pemberton's gambling debts became impossible to conceal. Creditors now visited their estate with increasing regularity. Several pieces of jewelry Davina had once displayed proudly at gatherings had been sold to cover mounting losses. The marriage she had paraded before society as proof of her superiority had become a source of private humiliation she could share with no one. Audley's loneliness continued expanding. Clement Hargrave now spent nearly every week in London, leaving her alone in a large estate managed by staff who reported to him rather than to her. During her increasingly frequent visits to Briarstone Hall, her cheerfulness had thinned into something brittle and transparent. She laughed at the right moments, but her eyes never matched. Cressida's glamorous marriage had darkened most visibly of all. Everett Langdale dictated nearly every decision in their household, from where she traveled to whom she visited. The generosity he once displayed before their wedding had vanished entirely, The woman who once commanded rooms with effortless confidence now hesitated before speaking in public. Yet none of the sisters examined their own unhappiness honestly. Doing so would have meant confronting the truth that the marriages they had mocked Verity for failing to achieve had not delivered the happiness they were promised. Instead, they redirected every ounce of resentment toward the one target that had always absorbed their cruelty without resistance. She manipulated him, Davina muttered during an afternoon gathering in the drawing room, while Verity supervised flower arrangements in the next room. No powerful man suddenly notices a woman like her without being led there deliberately. Ottilie nodded from beside the window, her teacup balanced in her lap. She presents herself as helpless. Men enjoy believing they are rescuing someone. Cressida's voice cut sharpest of all. She is enjoying this, watching us struggle while she parades around with the wealthiest duke in England paying attention to her. She is humiliating us on purpose. The jealousy turned active within weeks. Sly comments at dinner gatherings grew into deliberate campaigns. Davina encouraged rumors through society that Verity had emotionally entrapped the Duke using false vulnerability and rehearsed modesty. Ottilie mentioned Verity's age pointedly in conversations where she knew the remarks would travel. Cressida went further than both of them. During a dinner party hosted in London, Cressida secretly arranged for Lady Seraphine Culworth to attend. The invitation was delivered through an intermediary, so the connection to the Carden family remained invisible. Seraphine arrived wearing black velvet and pearls that glowed against her skin in the warm light. Throughout the evening, she positioned herself beside Calder with the confidence of a woman who believed familiarity entitled her to proximity. She touched his arm while speaking. She referenced shared memories from years earlier with the casual intimacy of someone reminding a man what he had lost. She laughed softly at his silence as though it were a private language only she understood. Verity watched from across the room, holding a glass she could not taste while something old and familiar tightened behind her ribs. Not jealousy in the possessive sense. Something closer to the fear that she had been foolish to believe someone like Calder Dunmore could genuinely choose someone like her when women like Seraphine existed in the same world. Then Seraphine leaned closer and murmured, just loudly enough for Verity to hear from several paces away. "You were happier before you became so guarded, Calder. I remember the man you used to be." Calder's expression did not soften. It hardened into something that resembled stone. "No. I was simply more easily deceived. The man I used to be no longer interests me." The rejection silenced Seraphine so completely that she excused herself from the conversation within moments, her poise cracking almost imperceptibly at the edges as she walked away. Later that evening, Calder returned unexpectedly to Briarstone Hall to retrieve correspondence he had left in Lord Edric's study earlier that week. As he walked through the dimly lit corridor beside the drawing room, raised voices stopped him. Davina's voice carried through the partially open door. "She is pathetic," trailing after him like a lost animal hoping for scraps. Cressida's laughter followed sharply. At her age, she would cling to any wealthy man who glanced in her direction. "It is embarrassing to watch." Ottilie added more softly, but no less cruelly. "Perhaps once the novelty wears off and he remembers what actual beauty looks like, the rest of us can stop pretending to celebrate this absurdity." Calder stood motionless in the corridor. His jaw tightened until the muscles along his cheekbones became visible. Then he pushed the door open without hesitation. Every voice in the room stopped instantly. Davina's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. Cressida's smirk collapsed. Ottilie's eyes widened. Even Lady Margot, seated near the fireplace, went pale. Calder's voice was controlled, measured, and precisely as devastating as a blade drawn with patience. "Tell me, what precisely has Miss Carden done to earn this treatment? Beyond enduring cruelty from her own family with more grace than any of you have shown in a single evening of your lives." Nobody answered. She organized every celebration this household has produced. She maintained this estate while its debts mounted around her. She treated servants, strangers, and even people who openly despised her with more genuine dignity than I have witnessed from anyone seated in this room tonight. Lord Edric, who had entered behind the Duke, stared at the floor in silence. Lady Margot's hands shook in her lap. Calder's eyes moved across each sister's face before he spoke again. "Verity Carden possesses more worth than this family has ever deserved. And if any of you speak about her this way again within my hearing, you will discover that my patience is considerably less generous than hers." He turned and left the room before anyone could form a response. The silence he left behind was absolute. Hours later, Verity stood alone beside the darkened garden windows at the far end of the east corridor. Rain streaked across the glass while the last embers of the drawing room fire cast faint orange light across the stone floor behind her. She had not been present during the confrontation, but Brinley had told her everything within minutes of it happening. When Calder found her, she was crying in silence. Not loudly, not for effect. The way someone cries when they have held everything inside for so long that the release comes out without sound. She wiped her face when she heard his footsteps, embarrassed by her own emotion. "Nobody has ever spoken for me before." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I did not know what it felt like. Something unlocked behind Calder's expression, something that had been sealed for a very long time. He did not speak. He stood beside her in the dark corridor while rain hammered against the windows, and neither of them needed to say anything more. That night, long after his carriage departed Briarstone Hall and the estate fell silent under the storm, Calder sat alone in the dim interior, a small lantern swaying gently from the ceiling hook above him. Resting in his hand was a ring box he had been carrying for the past 9 days. Inside it sat a diamond surrounded by pale sapphires, commissioned from a jeweler in London who had asked no questions about the recipient. He closed the box and pressed it against his chest, while the carriage rocked steadily through the rain toward London. He had already decided. The only question remaining was where and when, and whether the words he chose would be large enough to hold everything she deserved to hear. The Harrington Gala was the most anticipated social event of the London season, held annually inside the Grand Ballroom of Harrington House, a palatial estate near Kensington whose marble halls had hosted royalty, foreign diplomats, and England's highest nobility for over a century. The gala represented the pinnacle of aristocratic society. Attendance alone confirmed status. Being noticed there could alter a family's trajectory for generations. Chandeliers the size of carriages hung from painted ceilings where golden angels floated among clouds, rendered in oils by artists whose names alone commanded respect. Orchestras played under arched windows draped with ivory silk, while long banquet tables overflowed with roasted swan. Glazed lamb carved at the table by uniformed attendants, towers of sugared fruit, pastries layered with cream and spun sugar, imported wines from Burgundy and Champagne, and elaborate desserts sculpted into shapes that belonged inside museums rather than on dinner plates. Diamonds flashed from every direction. Perfume thickened the air. Laughter and conversation blended into a continuous hum that vibrated through the marble floors. Verity Carden had never felt more exposed. Lady Margot had dressed her in silver silk embroidered with tiny seed pearls that caught the light from every angle. Her dark hair was arranged simply but elegantly. Held by a single ivory comb Brinley had polished that morning with deliberate care. Verity looked beautiful. She knew this objectively the same way she might observe a well-executed illustration. Technically accomplished, emotionally detached from the result. Standing inside the ballroom surrounded by women whose beauty was effortless, and whose confidence had never once been challenged by the kind of systematic humiliation she had endured for a decade, every old wound reopened. Too old, unwanted, invisible. Her sisters noticed her discomfort at once. Cressida leaned toward Davina with a whisper designed to travel. "He has not arrived yet. Perhaps tonight she finally understands her position." Ottilie sipped champagne beside them, though anticipation flickered across all 3 faces. They believed the Duke would lose interest once surrounded by women of genuine social consequence. They believed the spell would break and the natural order would reassert itself. Across the ballroom, Lady Seraphine Colworth entered wearing deep emerald velvet trimmed with diamonds that rested against her throat like frozen starlight. Conversations shifted in her direction at once. She moved through the crowd with the commanding beauty of a woman who had spent her entire life being admired and had no intention of surrendering the position tonight. Then Duke Calder Dunmore entered the ballroom, and the atmosphere in the room changed so violently it was almost audible. Women straightened at once. Mothers gripped daughters' arms with urgent, whispered instructions. Young noblewomen adjusted their smiles and postures with the precision of soldiers preparing for inspection. Seraphine turned toward the entrance, her expression composed into confident warmth. Calder acknowledged none of it. He moved through the crowd the way weather moves through a landscape, present, powerful, and indifferent to the reactions it caused. Verity watched from near the edge of the ballroom, holding a glass she had not touched once. She expected nothing from the evening, except survival. She had learned long ago that expecting more than that only made the disappointment heavier. Then she noticed movement. Calder had stopped accepting greetings. He was walking now, with purpose, through the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted for him instinctively. In his left hand, held low against his side, rested a small velvet box. Whispers ignited across the room. Women straightened in anticipation. Seraphine's smile widened as his path seemed to angle in her general direction. He walked past her without slowing. He continued past every celebrated beauty in the room, past the politicians' daughters, past the heiresses, past the women whose names appeared regularly in society columns and whose faces had been painted by the finest portrait artists in London. He walked through the center of England's most exclusive gathering with hundreds of eyes fixed upon him and not a single hesitation in his step. He stopped directly before Verity. Complete silence swallowed the ballroom. Verity stared at him. The glass wavered in her grip while blood rushed painfully into her face. Around them, hundreds of guests watched without breathing. Calder opened the velvet box. Inside rested a diamond surrounded by pale sapphires that caught the light from the chandeliers and scattered it across the space between them like tiny stars. When he spoke, his voice carried across the silent hall. Not loudly. He did not need volume. The silence itself amplified every word. Miss Verity Carden, I have spent most of my life surrounded by people who valued beauty, status, and wealth above everything else. I accepted that world because I believed nothing better existed. Nobody in the ballroom moved. Then I watched you kneel on a marble floor in a crowded ballroom and wrap a frightened servant's bleeding hand with your own handkerchief, without hesitation, without concern for who was watching, without any thought for yourself at all. Verity felt tears building behind her eyes with a pressure she could not control. You treated people with more genuine respect than most nobles offer their closest allies. You remained kind after enduring cruelty that would have destroyed lesser hearts. You carried a family that never once carried you, and you did it without bitterness, without resentment, and without ever asking for recognition. Cressida's face had drained completely of color. Davina looked as though the floor had shifted under her. Ottilie stood frozen beside Clement, who for once was paying attention. Lady Margot's expression carried something far heavier than shock. Regret moved visibly across her features like weather crossing a landscape. Calder stepped closer. His voice softened, but the ballroom was so still that every syllable reached the furthest walls. I once said I would sooner marry a stranger than any woman performing in a room full of society. He paused. I did not know that the stranger standing behind me that night would become the only woman I have ever truly respected, the only woman who never once asked me for anything, and the only woman I want beside me for the rest of my life. A broken sound escaped Verity before she could stop it. Years of humiliation, loneliness, grief, and silence crashed against her chest simultaneously. Tears spilled freely down her face while her hands pressed against her mouth. Verity, he said, will you do me the honor of becoming my Duchess? For several agonizing seconds, she could not speak. The word fought its way through everything that had accumulated inside her across a decade of being told she was not enough. Yes. The single syllable had barely left her lips before applause erupted across the ballroom. Lady Seraphine turned away, her poise breaking at last as she disappeared into the crowd. Whispers exploded through the room in every direction. Cressida lowered her eyes, something she had never done in her adult life. Davina stood motionless, her wineglass untouched. Lord Edric stared at his eldest daughter as though seeing her for the first time, and the expression on his face was not pride. It was the terrible understanding that he had never once looked at her properly before this moment. And Verity Carden, standing in the center of the grandest ballroom in London, wearing a ring that carried the weight of being chosen, not for beauty, not for status, not for youth, but for the heart she had carried through every cruel year, finally allowed herself to believe that she had always been enough. Years passed after that night. As Duchess of Dunmore, Verity became beloved across the northern counties, not because of her title, but because of the kindness she carried into it. She visited tenant families during difficult seasons, remembering children's names and asking after elderly relatives. She opened Dunmore Keep's grounds to local communities during holidays and funded a small school for workers' children on the estate. Servants spoke about her with genuine warmth rather than practiced deference. She treated every person who entered her household the way she had always treated people, with attention, with care, and without ever calculating what she might receive in return. Her botanical illustrations, published for years under the pseudonym V. Ashridge, were finally released under her true name. The third volume, completed during the darkest months at Briarstone Hall, received recognition from the Royal Horticultural Society. Collectors who had admired the anonymous artist's work for years discovered that the woman behind the delicate illustrations of foxglove and hawthorn and wild orchids had produced them by the light of a single candle inside a locked bedroom, hiding her talent inside a false wardrobe panel because the family she lived among would have considered it beneath them. The revelation made the illustrations more valuable, but more importantly, it confirmed something Verity had always known, and the world had only just begun to understand. She had never been the person her family described. She had been someone remarkable all along, building in the spaces nobody thought to look. Calder, for his part, changed as well. He remained a private man who preferred silence to spectacle and substance to performance. But the coldness that had defined him for nearly a decade softened gradually in Verity's presence. He smiled more often, though never publicly. He laughed on occasion, though only she heard it. The halls of Dunmore Keep, once silent as a mausoleum, began to hold warmth again. Flowers appeared in rooms that had stood empty for years. Music drifted from the drawing room on evenings, when Verity played piano beside the fire while Calder read correspondence nearby, content simply to share the same space with someone whose presence demanded nothing from him except honesty. Meanwhile, the lives her sisters had once displayed as proof of their superiority collapsed under the weight of their own foundations. Lord Aldous Pemberton's gambling debts consumed Davina's household entirely. Creditors seized their London property. Aldous disappeared abroad with a woman half his age, leaving Davina publicly humiliated and financially ruined in the very society she had once dominated. Clement Hargrave's political career ended abruptly after a scandal involving misused parliamentary funds. Ottilie, abandoned in a large estate she could not afford to maintain alone, retreated into an isolation that mirrored the loneliness she had endured throughout her marriage, but could no longer disguise behind social appearances. Everett Langdale grew colder and more distant with every passing year, until society itself began whispering. Cressida, once the most confident woman in any room she entered, became withdrawn and unhappy. The diamond ring she had once displayed like a trophy now sat inside a drawer she rarely opened. One winter afternoon, 3 familiar carriages arrived outside Dunmore Keep. They moved up the long gravel drive between bare oak trees, while snow fell softly across the grounds. The women who stepped out were not the same women who had once mocked Verity across candlelit ballrooms. Their gowns were simpler. Their faces carried exhaustion instead of pride. Their jewelry had been reduced to modest pieces that spoke of necessity rather than choice. Inside the grand drawing room, beside a fire that crackled warmly against the winter cold, Verity received them calmly. None of her sisters could meet her eyes easily. Davina's hands twisted in her lap. Ottilie stared at the floor. Cressida, who had once stretched a diamond ring before Verity's face with calculated cruelty, sat with her shoulders curved inward, as though trying to occupy less space in the room. The silence lasted a long time. Then Davina spoke, her voice carrying none of the sharpness it once held. "We do not deserve your kindness." Verity studied her sisters for several moments. She saw their pain, not with satisfaction and not with bitterness, but with the steady, clear-eyed compassion of a woman who understood suffering intimately because she had lived inside it for years, before anyone bothered to notice. She called for tea. She called for warm food. She offered them rooms for as long as they needed, and she asked Brinley to prepare fires in the East Wing. Because in the end, the greatest victory was never revenge. It was becoming loved for the very heart they had once dismissed as worthless. And England eventually learned what the Carden family discovered, far too late. True worth was never found in beauty, youth, or status. It lived in loyalty, kindness, and the unbreakable strength of a woman the world had overlooked, standing silently behind a duke who had the wisdom to turn around.